I've been asked 100 times to explain what it felt like when the Kethal first called us. People expect me to say something poetic, something about the weight of the moment, the gravity of first contact happening under those circumstances, the philosophical enormity of a species reaching across the dark between stars and finding us on the other end of the line. But honestly, the first thing I thought when Commander Vrethel's transmission came through was, this better not be another drill. That's the truth. That's the unglamorous, undignified truth. I'd been awake for 31 hours. I had cold coffee growing a skin at my elbow. I was wearing the same shirt I'd had on the previous morning, and there was a pen mark on my left hand from where I'd fallen asleep at my desk, and my hand had dragged across an open notebook. The emergency klaxons had gone off at the Interstellar Liaison office 6 times in the past month for equipment malfunctions, for sensor glitches, for a particularly aggressive flock of starlings that had decided the satellite array on the roof was a good nesting spot. So when the board lit up with an incoming signal on the Kethal diplomatic channel, the real one, the one nobody actually expected to be used for anything serious, my first reaction was to groan, not gasp, not stand up straight with some dawning sense of historical responsibility. I groaned. I rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand. I reached over and smeared the pen mark on my palm against my thigh. And then I put on my headset and took the call. My name is Delegate Nora Vasquez Holt. I worked at the Interstellar Liaison office in Geneva for 11 years before the crisis, and I was the senior communications officer on duty the night the Kethal begged us for help. I want to be very clear about that word, begged, because it matters for everything that came after. The Kethal had been our allies for about 6 years at that point. Not close allies, not the kind of allies where you know each other's children's names and share meals and argue about politics in a comfortable way. More like the kind of allies you make at work when you realize you both hate the same coworker. The Kethal and humanity had a shared interest in keeping the Vorathi consortium from expanding into the rim sectors, and that shared interest had been enough to build something that looked, on paper, like a meaningful partnership. In practice, they found us baffling. We found them exhausting. The Kethal are, and I say this with complete diplomatic neutrality that I've had years to develop, the most cautious species in the known galaxy. They plan for everything. They wargame every scenario. They have a word in their language, Vrethek, that roughly translates to the specific anxiety caused by insufficient contingency planning, and it's considered one of the worst emotional states a Kethal can experience. They sleep in rotating shifts so that half their population is always awake. They don't build anything without redundancies. They don't sign anything without 17 layers of review. They are, in short, the opposite of everything humanity is. And they called us because they were desperate. Commander Vrethel's voice came through the translation matrix the way it always did, smooth and slightly too low, with those strange harmonic undertones that Kethal voices carry, the ones that sound like two people speaking in almost perfect unison. The translation software flattened it out into something that sounded more or less human, but you could still hear the texture underneath if you listened carefully. "Delegate Vasquez Holt," he said, "we require immediate consultation. The situation is," and here he paused, and that pause said more than the words that followed, because Commander Vrethel did not pause. He was a being who had contingency plans for his contingency plans. He paused the way a skyscraper pauses before it falls. "The situation has exceeded our modeled parameters." I sat up. The pen mark on my palm caught the light. "Commander," I said, "how far exceeded?" Another pause. "All of them," he said. Here's what had happened. Here's the part that took the next 4 hours to piece together from his report, from the fragmentary data he was transmitting while we talked, from the emergency feeds that started coming in from Kethal monitoring stations in the outer rim. The Gretvan had woken up. Now I need to explain the Gretvan. Because if you've heard about them at all, you've probably heard the sanitized version, the one that makes them sound like a natural disaster, a force of nature, something impersonal, something without malice, like a hurricane or a tsunami. The kind of thing you can look at from a comfortable distance and categorize and file away. That is not what the Gretvan are. The Gretvan are the oldest known spacefaring species in this sector of the galaxy, older than the Kethal by about 40,000 years, older than any species in the current Interstellar Emergency Coalition by so much that the math stops being meaningful. They had built and destroyed civilizations before humanity learned to chip flint. They had gone to war with entities we don't have names for. They had, at some point roughly 30,000 years ago, decided to stop. Not to stop expanding, not to stop fighting, to stop everything, to hibernate, to go dormant en masse across 17 systems in structures so vast and so old that most coalition species had reclassified them as geological features, mountains, reef formations, dead asteroids with unusually regular internal geometries. The Kethal knew they were there. Every major species knew they were there. And for 30,000 years, every major species had an unspoken agreement that we did not go near them. We did not touch them, and we very, very specifically did not do anything that might be construed as waking them up. The Vorathi Consortium had been strip mining Gretvan dormancy structures for raw materials for roughly 8 months before anyone realized what they were doing. By the time the monitoring stations picked up the resonance signatures of mass reactivation events, by the time the alarm got through the bureaucratic channels of the coalition, by the time the data was cross-referenced and verified, and the appropriate emergency committees were assembled, the Gretvan had been awake for 6 weeks. And they were angry. Not hurricane angry, not force of nature angry. Personally, intentionally, specifically angry. "What is your current position?" I asked Commander Vrethel. I was already pulling up the tactical overlays on the secondary screen. The liaison office had those kinds of screens. Everyone assumed they were there for show. Honestly, the kind of impressive-looking equipment that got installed to impress visiting dignitaries and then gathered dust. Turns out they were there for exactly this kind of situation. "Kethal Prime Defensive Perimeter," he said. "We have." Another pause, shorter this time, but I was getting good at reading them. "We have lost contact with the 6th and 9th Fleets. We have lost contact with the monitoring station at Verath 7. We have partial contact with the Coalition Command Vessel Equinox of Hope." I typed that last one into the search panel and pulled up the ship registry. Coalition Command Vessel Equinox of Hope. Crew complement, 4,200. Coalition Command Staff, 116. Currently assigned sector, Outer Rim Patrol, Verath Corridor. "What does partial contact mean?" I asked. "It means," Commander Vrethel said, "that we are receiving automated distress signals only. We are not receiving responses to direct communication." I sat with that for a moment. "Commander, I need to ask you a direct question." "Ask it." "Why are you calling us?" The pause this time was different, longer, the kind of pause that costs something. "Because," he said, "we have exhausted every other option. Humanity is the only coalition member species with the situational adaptability that this crisis may require." I knew what he meant. He couldn't quite make himself say it, even then, even in extremis, even with his fleets gone dark and his monitoring stations silent. 30,000 years of careful, cautious, perfectly planned Kethal culture wouldn't let him just come out and say, "We need people who are crazy enough to try something." "Give me 6 hours," I said. Delegate Vasquez Holt. 6 hours, Commander. Get me everything you have on the Gretvan's last known position and movement vectors. Get me the structural data on whatever dormancy sites are still intact, and get me a direct line to Admiral Reyes. Another pause. "Admiral Reyes is," he stopped. I know what Admiral Reyes is, I said. Get me the line anyway. Admiral Elena Reyes was, at the time I called her, 73 years old. She had been commanding vessels in one form or another for 45 years. She had 3 prosthetic fingers on her left hand from a combat situation in the Jovian conflict that she never talked about in detail. She had a son who was a schoolteacher in Guadalajara and a daughter who was a marine biologist studying cephalopod cognition on Europa. And she talked about both of them with the specific mix of pride and wistfulness that people develop when they've spent most of their lives in space and not nearly enough time at home. She was also, and I say this with the utmost respect and genuine admiration, absolutely terrifying. Not in the way that some military commanders are terrifying, not cold, not distant, not the kind of person who processes people as assets and outcomes as statistics. She was terrifying the way a very specific kind of competent person is terrifying. The kind who looks at an impossible situation and immediately starts identifying the angles. The kind whose mind starts working faster, not slower, when the parameters exceed the models. When I got her on the line, she was eating a sandwich. "Vasquez Holt," she said, "this better be worth waking the 7th Fleet." "The Gretven are awake," I said. A chewing sound, then silence, then the sound of a sandwich being set down. "Send me everything," she said. "I'll call you back in 20 minutes." She called back in 12. There's a Kethal concept, not Vrethik this time, a different one called Okethvrath. The closest English translation is something like, the moment when planning becomes irrelevant and only motion matters. It's not quite the same as what we'd call instinct or improvisation. It's more like the recognition that you've run out of time to be careful and you have to act with what you have. The Kethal consider Okethvrath a failure state, a symptom of insufficient preparation, something to be avoided at all costs. Admiral Reyes called it Tuesday. She brought 3 vessels into the Varath corridor, not the full 7th Fleet that would have taken weeks to assemble, and we didn't have weeks. The Meridian, the Constant, and the Argus, 3 ships, 3 crews. A combined complement of about 8,000 people, though by the time they actually launched, the roster was somewhere closer to 7,400 because a decision had been made, her decision, and she's never apologized for it, to not bring anyone who wasn't there voluntarily. She stood in front of every crew manifest meeting personally, every ship. She laid out what they knew, what they didn't know, and what they were walking toward. She told them the odds she'd been given by the Kethal tactical analysis, the ones that came out of a system that had never been wrong before by more than 3%, and that were currently showing a 94% probability of engagement resulting in total vessel loss. And then she said, "If you want off this ship, you have 12 hours to file your transfer and I will sign it myself and I will never think less of you for it. This is not an order. This is a request." 600 people filed transfers. 7,400 stayed. I wasn't on any of those ships. I want to be honest about that. I was in Geneva, at my desk, with my cold coffee and my pen-marked palm, running the communications relay between the Kethal command structure and the human fleet. I was watching through feeds and data streams and translated reports. I was not there. But I talked to people who were. I've spent the past 3 years collecting their accounts, their testimonies, their handwritten letters and voice recordings and shaky video clips taken on personal devices. I've read them more times than I can count, and I want to try to render what they experienced in a way that doesn't flatten it, because the flatness is the thing that does it the most disservice. So let me tell you about Lieutenant Commander Diho Shin, who was stationed on the Meridian's forward observation deck when they came out of jump. Shin had been in the coalition forces for 15 years. He'd done 2 tours in the Jovian conflict, a 3-year assignment on the monitoring station at Varath 4 before it went dark, and a stretch of what the official records politely called classified tactical operations that he still couldn't talk about in detail. He was 39 years old. He had a habit of cracking his knuckles in a specific sequence, left hand, then right, then both thumbs, when he was thinking hard about something, and the people who'd served with him for years said you could always tell when something was serious because his hands would be going constantly. He told me about coming out of jump. "You know how it usually looks," he said. "You come out of a jump and for a second everything's this kind of gray-white, like the ship is pushing through something thick, and then it clears and you've got stars. Black and stars and whatever you jump toward. Normal, predictable." He paused. He cracked his left knuckles. "We came out of jump and it was red. Not red like an alert. Red like the space itself had changed color. The Gretvan, when they're fully active, generate a field that the Kethal called Vrethemel. There's no good translation, but it's something like the light of old anger. It's not a weapon, not exactly. It's a byproduct of their energy systems running at full capacity, and it saturates the local space in this deep, bloody, beautiful red that looks like a nebula but isn't. It moves. It pulses. It has something uncomfortably close to rhythm. Like a heartbeat," Shin said. "That's what everyone said, like the space itself had a heartbeat." The Meridian's forward observation deck went silent when they came through. 40 people who'd signed on voluntarily, who'd been briefed on everything they were walking into, and not one of them said a word for about 30 seconds, because no briefing had prepared them for the red. The Gretvan vessels were "I'm struggling here because vessel doesn't really capture it." The Kethal called them a Lethvar, which translates roughly as world ships, and that's closer but still not quite right because it implies something built for civilians, for families, for migration. The Gretvan Alethvar weren't built for comfort. They were built for presence, for the specific communication of power. The smallest one in the Varath corridor was approximately 40 kilometers long. The largest was closer to 250. They moved slowly, not because they couldn't move fast, but because they didn't need to. When you are 250 kilometers of ancient aggression, and the thing you're expressing is "we are here and we are awake," you don't rush. There were 9 of them, against 3 human ships that, at their longest point, measured about 800 meters. Shin told me what Admiral Reyes said when the tactical display came up, and the size differential became undeniable. She said, "Good, I can see them clearly." Nobody laughed, but later he said people kept coming back to that. "I can see them clearly," because there was something in it that wasn't bravado and wasn't denial and wasn't even exactly humor. It was more like orientation, like she'd looked at the thing and decided where she stood in relation to it, like the bigness of it was information, not verdict. The Gretvan made contact first. This surprised everyone. The Kethal had been certain the Gretvan were past communication, past anything resembling diplomatic engagement. Their tactical models had been built on the assumption that the Gretvan would treat all current spacefaring species as irrelevant noise and proceed directly to systematic demolition of anything in their vicinity. The Vorathi Consortium had clearly been classified as an existential irritant, and the destruction of Vorathi assets in the rim sectors had been methodical and apparently joyless, not the behavior of a species that was interested in conversation. But they hailed the Meridian. Not in galactic common, not in Kethal, in a language that the translation matrix took 47 minutes to parse because it wasn't anything in the current database. It was old, older than the database, older probably than the languages the database was built from. What came through, after 47 minutes of the translation system working harder than it had ever worked before, was this: "Small new makers, you are not the destroyers, speak." Admiral Reyes spoke. "I have the transcript. I've read it enough times that I could probably recite it from memory, but I want to be precise, so I'll reconstruct it from the official record." She identified herself: name, rank, ship, mission, factual, clear, no performance. Then she said, We're here because the beings who disturbed your rest have been identified and isolated. We can provide you with their exact location. We are not here to fight you. We are here to talk." There was a 22-minute pause before the response came. "Talk," the Gretven said, and the translation matrix was already getting better at it, already learning the patterns, is what small new makers do instead of understanding. "What do you understand?" And Reyes said, without hesitation, without taking 22 minutes to think about it, "That you've been asleep for 30,000 years and something woke you up and you're angry, and that you have every right to be." Another pause, shorter. "The Kethal did not say this." "The Kethal sent us," Reyes said, "because we're better at this kind of conversation. There's a moment in every account I've collected from people who were on those ships, a moment they all describe differently, but that all point to the same thing. The moment when it became clear that this was not going to be the confrontation everyone had prepared for. The moment when the situation turned, and the turning was visible, and nobody quite knew what to do with that visibility. For Shin, it was when the Gretvan vessels changed their formation. They'd been positioned like, he thought for a moment, like a fist. That's the best way I can describe it. 9 vessels positioned like a fist ready to close, and they opened up, just opened their formation, spread out, not into an attack spread, into something that looked more like listening. He cracked his knuckles, both hands. "I don't know if that's what it actually was," he said. "I'm projecting human body language onto a 30,000-year-old alien species, but it looked like listening." The conversation took 11 days. 11 days of back and forth across a translation matrix that kept getting better the more it was used. 11 days of Admiral Reyes standing her watch, sleeping in 4-hour rotations, eating her meals at the communication console. 11 days of the red light pulsing outside the observation windows, and the 3 human ships sitting small and patient in the face of 9 ancient world ships. I was on the relay for most of it. When I wasn't, my deputy, a young officer named Patel, held the console. We slept in shifts. We mainlined coffee that was always either too hot or too cold and never quite right. The liaison office in Geneva became a temporary living situation that nobody had planned for but everyone adapted to, because that's what you do. What came out of those 11 days, piece by piece, in a translation that kept evolving, in a language that was teaching itself to the matrix in real time, was something none of us had expected. A history, a testimony, a record. The Gretvan, it turned out, had not gone dormant out of exhaustion or defeat, or the natural end state of a species that had simply run out of reasons to be awake. They had gone dormant deliberately. They had made a choice, as a civilization, after a war that lasted 4,000 years, and ended in a victory so complete and so terrible that they had looked at what they'd become in the winning of it and decided they needed to stop. They had been, and this is the translation matrix's best rendering of a concept that didn't have a direct equivalent in galactic common. They had been, they said, the real monsters. Not their enemies, not the species they'd fought, themselves, the things they'd done to win, the kind of beings they'd had to become to survive against something that had been trying to erase them for 4 millennia. They'd won. They'd survived. They'd looked around at the galaxy they'd saved and realized they no longer recognized themselves in it. So they'd slept. Not to die, not to give up, to forget, to let enough time pass that the things they'd done might thin out, might become history instead of memory, might let them wake up as something that hadn't done those things yet in any living sense. 30,000 years, they'd calculated, would be enough. They were in therapy, Shin said. The whole species, 30,000 years of sleep as therapy. That's what Admiral Reyes told us when she briefed the crew after the 3rd day of translation. She just said it flat out like it was obvious. They went dormant because they were traumatized and they needed time. And I remember thinking, I remember this so clearly that I had no idea what to do with that information. He was quiet for a moment. None of us did. You show up to this thing prepared for a fight, or prepared to die, or prepared for some kind of ancient, unstoppable force of nature situation. You don't show up prepared for, he gestured vaguely, for something that's just incredibly sad. The Vorathi Consortium had not known about any of this. That's important to understand. They hadn't been acting out of malice toward the Gretvan. They hadn't known what the dormancy structures were. They'd had incomplete data, bad survey work, a profit motive that overwhelmed whatever caution might have otherwise kicked in. They'd mined structures they thought were dead geological formations because the raw materials were valuable and the extraction was easy. The Gretvan's anger, when it came through the translation matrix fully and clearly around day 4 or 5 of the communication, was not the impersonal anger of a species defending territory. It was the specific, personal, shattered fury of someone who woke up to find strangers rifling through their home. 30,000 years of careful sleep. 30,000 years of trying to become something that hadn't done the things they'd done, and they'd been woken up by mining equipment. Admiral Reyes, when the full weight of that came through the matrix, was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I'm sorry, I mean that. I know I'm not responsible for what happened and I know sorry doesn't fix it, but I'm sorry. That's a terrible thing to do to someone, even if you didn't know you were doing it." The Gretvan were quiet for 3 hours after that, the longest gap in the conversation so far. When they responded, the translation matrix rendered it as, "You are a strange people. You apologize for what you did not do." "Someone had to," Reyes said. "Here's where it gets complicated. Here's where the story stops being the story everyone wants it to be, the clean, triumphant story where humanity saves the day through ingenuity and grit, and becomes something messier and more true. Because on day 7 of the communication, the Gretvan asked a question. They asked where the destroyers were, the ones who had torn open their homes. They asked this in a way that made very clear what they intended to do when they found out. And Admiral Reyes answered. She gave them the location of the Vorathi Consortium's main industrial hub in the Outer Rim. She transmitted the coordinates, the fleet disposition, the current asset inventory. Everything the Coalition's intelligence apparatus had on the Consortium's operation in the area. She did not consult the Kethal first. She did not consult Geneva first. She did not consult the Coalition's legal framework for interstellar conflict resolution, which runs to approximately 9,000 pages in the Standard Edition and requires a 3/4 majority vote to invoke in anything above a Class 3 incident. She gave an ancient, traumatized, monumentally powerful species the address of the people who had wronged them and stepped aside. I found out what she'd done about an hour after it happened. Commander Vrethel had been monitoring the communication, obviously. The Kethal had the best passive surveillance equipment in the Coalition, and they were absolutely using it, and his transmission to me came in with what I can only describe as a controlled freak-out energy. The kind of carefully worded diplomatic communication that, if you know how to read it, is actually screaming. He wanted to know if Admiral Reyes had exceeded her mandate. He wanted to know if humanity was prepared to accept responsibility for whatever the Gretvan did to the Vorathi Consortium on the basis of coordinates provided by a human military officer. He wanted to know, in the very careful diplomatic language that the Kethal use for things they're too alarmed to say directly, if we had lost our minds. I stared at my screen for a long time. Then I called Reyes. "I know why you're calling," she said. She sounded tired. Not the tired of someone who'd done something wrong and knew it, the tired of someone who'd done something difficult and was prepared to carry the weight of it. "Admiral, they were going to find the Consortium with or without us," she said. "They're 30,000-year-old navigators who have been mapping this sector since before we existed. The only question was whether we were going to pretend we didn't know where to point them, and whether that pretense was going to cost us the only functional diplomatic channel we had. The coalition legal framework. Vasquez Holt, her voice was not unkind. The Gretven are not a coalition matter. They are not a party to the coalition charter. They are not subject to our conflict resolution protocols. We do not have jurisdiction over a species that was running an interstellar civilization while our ancestors were painting caves. I was quiet. What I did, she said, was tell an injured party who hurt them. That's it. What they do with that information is on them and on the consortium. The consortium violated a dormancy site that every civilized species in this sector has agreed to treat as sacred. They didn't know, and that matters for how we talk about it later, but it doesn't make the violation not happen. I rubbed my pen-marked palm against my desk without thinking about it. The Kethal are going to file a formal protest, I said. I know. This is going to create a diplomatic situation that outlasts both of us. I know that too. Do you have any regrets? A pause, not like Vrethel's pauses, which were full of calculation and contingency. A different kind of pause, the kind that holds something real in it. Ask me again in 10 years, she said, when we see what the Gretvan do with what they've become. What the Gretvan did to the Vorathi consortium is documented in the official coalition records. I won't reproduce it here in detail. What I will say is this. It was not what anyone expected. The coalition's models, the Kethal's models especially, had predicted systematic destruction. The kind of methodical, overwhelming, disproportionate response that made sense when you were dealing with a species that had built civilizations and fought wars on a scale that dwarfed everything in the current coalition combined. The kind of response that said, we are what we were, and what we were does not stop. The Gretven went to the Vorathi consortium's industrial hub. They broadcast a message on every frequency the consortium used. The translation matrix caught it and rendered it in galactic common, and it was transmitted across every coalition monitoring station in the outer rim. The message said, you did not know what you were destroying. We understand that you did not know. We are telling you now. What you stripped from the dormancy sites, return it. Whatever materials you extracted, whatever equipment you installed, whatever you altered, restore it or replace it or make restitution for what cannot be restored. You have 2 of your years to begin. We will be watching. This is not a threat. This is an accounting. We remember everything we have destroyed in anger. We choose not to add to that memory. And then they left. They went back to the dormancy sites, the ones that were still intact. And over the following months, this is documented. This is in the observational record from a dozen coalition monitoring stations. They began the work of repairing the sites that had been damaged, not with the technology the Vorathi had used. With something older, something the Kethal scientific teams who later got access to the sites described as almost incomprehensible in its sophistication. Repairing, carefully and slowly and with evident care, the structures they'd built 30,000 years ago to let themselves sleep. Getting ready, the coalition's analysts concluded to go back to sleep. But not yet, not until the accounting was done. Shin told me about the day the Gretven formations finally began to pull back. Day 9 of the communication. He was still on the forward observation deck. He'd barely left it in 9 days, sleeping in a chair they dragged over from the adjacent crew lounge, eating what people brought him. They just started moving, he said, slowly, the way they'd arrived. And for a minute I thought they were repositioning, taking up a different formation, because the idea that they were actually leaving, actually pulling back voluntarily, wasn't something I'd let myself think about too much, in case it didn't happen. He stopped. And then the red started fading, he said. The light, the Vrethamel, it didn't go all at once, it took hours. It went the way a sunset goes, and I was watching it go, and I realized I was crying and I didn't know when I'd started. He cracked his knuckles, left hand, right hand, both thumbs. Not because I was relieved exactly. I mean, I was relieved, obviously, but that wasn't the main thing. The main thing was, he was quiet for a moment, figuring out how to say it. The main thing was that I felt like I'd witnessed something. Something I wasn't going to be able to explain to people. About what they were and what they'd chosen, and the cost of what they'd done, and the cost of what they'd decided not to do anymore. About what it looks like when something incredibly powerful makes a decision to be different than what it is. He looked at his hands. "I've never felt that way in my life," he said. "Before or since. It was terrible and it was beautiful and I didn't want it to end." The diplomatic fallout was, as I'd predicted, extensive. The Kethal filed a formal protest regarding Admiral Reyes's unilateral disclosure of Vorathi asset locations. The Vorathi Consortium filed multiple complaints with the coalition mediation body, though these were substantially complicated by the fact that the consortium had clearly violated the Dormancy Site Preservation Accord of 2197, which they'd signed but apparently not read closely enough. The coalition's legal apparatus spent the better part of 18 months sorting through questions about jurisdiction, precedent, accountability, and what exactly the phrase civilized species meant in the context of a species that predated civilization as the coalition understood it. Admiral Reyes submitted to a formal inquiry. She answered every question. She didn't apologize for her decision, but she didn't posture about it either. She explained her reasoning in the same flat, clear, direct way she'd explained everything else, and she accepted whatever consequence came out of the process. The inquiry concluded with what the official summary called a finding of operational judgment exercised under extreme circumstances, and what Reyes called, privately, a very expensive slap on the wrist. She retired from active command 6 months later, not forced out. She'll tell you, just done. She lives in Guadalajara now, near her son. She teaches a seminar at the university on interstellar crisis management. I went to one of her seminars once, sat in the back. She didn't spot me until the Q&A, and then she raised an eyebrow across the room, and I raised my coffee cup, and she smiled for about half a second. Her students ask her all the time whether she would do it again, whether she'd make the same call. She always says the same thing. I did what the situation required with what I had. The next situation won't be that situation. Figure out your own answer. The Kethal took longer to process what had happened. They're built for processing, Vrethek, remember, the anxiety of insufficient planning, and having your models fail at this scale is something that doesn't resolve quickly for them. Commander Vrethel and I had a long conversation about 3 months after the crisis, when things had settled enough to be talked about in the past tense. "You were correct," he said, "that the situation required humans." "I wouldn't say it like that," I said. "How would you say it?" I thought about it. I'd say the situation required people who were willing to be present with something terrible and stay in the room. He was quiet for a moment. "That is what we cannot do," he said. "We plan for every eventuality so that we never have to be present with the unplanned. The Gretvan were unplanned. There is no—" he made a sound that might have been frustration. "There is no contingency protocol for something that is 30,000 years old and full of grief. We did not know how to be in that room. Admiral Reyes knew how to be in that room." "Reyes is unusual even for humans," I said. "Perhaps," he said, "but she is not impossible for humans. That is the difference." I've been asked in the years since to characterize what humanity brought to the crisis. What the thing was that we did that the other species couldn't. People want it to be something heroic and uncomplicated. They want it to be bravery, or firepower, or the specifically human quality of not knowing when you're outmatched. And there's truth in all of those things. I won't pretend there isn't. But here's what I think the real answer is. The Gretvan had called themselves the real monsters, the things they'd done in their war, the things they'd had to become. That's why they'd slept, not to hide from their enemies, but to hide from themselves. To let enough time pass that maybe the monsters could rest and something else could wake up instead. And Admiral Reyes, who had 3 prosthetic fingers and a sandwich on her desk and 45 years of impossible decisions behind her, had sat across the communication channel from 9 worldships full of ancient grief and said, "I hear you. You have every right to be angry. I'm sorry that happened to you. What do you need? Not we can take you. Not back down. Not here's our tactical assessment and here are our terms. Just I hear you." Because humans, messy, improvising, catastrophically underplanned humans, are, when it matters, occasionally brilliant at recognizing another person's pain even when that person is 250 kilometers long and can trace their history back 40,000 years and hasn't been awake for 3 decades of millennia. We didn't win the crisis by being stronger. We won it by being willing to sit with something broken and not flinch. There's a postscript to all of this, something that didn't make it into the official records that I know about because I've spent 3 years collecting the informal testimony, the things people said in letters and personal recordings and quiet conversations over drinks. On the last day of the communication, day 11, before the Gretvan formations began their slow withdrawal, there was an exchange that didn't go into the official transcript, not because anyone suppressed it, because it happened in a moment when the recording equipment on the Meridian's communication console had a 3-minute system reset, and those 3 minutes fell exactly during this particular exchange. Shin was the one who told me about it. He was present. He remembered it. The Gretvan, as the conversation was winding down, as both sides were doing the careful, quiet work of ending something that had gone better than anyone had a right to expect, the Gretvan said something. They said in the translation matrix's rendering, "You are small. You are new. You make everything complicated. You apologize for things you did not do and take responsibility for things that are not yours. You are strange, and we do not fully understand you." And Admiral Reyes, who was at the end of 11 days of almost no sleep and who had been carrying the weight of 7,400 people and the diplomatic future of humanity, and a decision she'd made alone on day 7 that she was still making peace with, Admiral Reyes said, "Yeah, that's about right." And the Gretvan said, "We will remember you." And Reyes said, "Same." That was the part that didn't make the transcript. Those last few lines. The ones that sounded, Shin said, like 2 people who had been through something together and were saying goodbye at a train station and knew they might not see each other again and were trying to hold the moment without making it too heavy. He told me he went back to his chair afterward, the crew lounge chair they dragged over at the start of the 9 days. He sat down, and someone brought him coffee, real coffee, not the recycled composite the ships usually ran on. Someone had apparently been hoarding the real stuff for a moment that warranted it, and he sat there and drank his coffee and watched the red light fade from the stars. "I've thought about it a lot," he said. "What the Gretvan meant, we will remember you. What that means for a species that's 30,000 years old. What it means for them to add us to whatever record they keep." He was quiet. "I hope it means something good," he said. "I hope when they wake up again, whenever that is, if it is, I hope what they remember is that someone was there when they needed it. Even if we were small, even if we were strange, even if everything was complicated." He set down his coffee cup. "I hope they remember that we stayed in the room." This document was compiled at the request of the Interstellar Emergency Coalition's Historical Preservation Office, and is dedicated to the crew of the Meridian, the Constant, and the Argus. It is also dedicated to the 7,400 people who were asked if they wanted to leave and chose to stay. And to Admiral Elena Reyes, who ate her sandwich, made her call and answered every question. And to Commander Vrethel of the Kethal, who finally found a situation he hadn't planned for and had the grace to admit it. And in whatever way this kind of dedication reaches across the silence between stars, to the Gretvan, who went asleep because they'd become monsters, and woke up and chose, at the first real test, to be something else. The Gretvan Dormancy Restoration Project is, as of this writing, approximately 60% complete. Coalition monitoring stations in the Outer Rim report that the remaining active Gretvan vessels have reduced their emission signatures significantly over the past year. A sign, according to the Kethal's updated models, heavily revised after the crisis, of approaching dormancy. The Vrethamel, the light of old anger, has almost entirely faded from the Vereth corridor. It's just stars now, blackened stars the way it always was. The Vorathi Consortium completed the first phase of its restitution obligations 14 months after the crisis. The coalition mediators report that the remaining phases are proceeding on schedule, with the consortium's representatives describing the process as, and I'm quoting from the official summary here, uncomfortable but appropriate. Which sounds about right.